I'm very pleased and feel very much honored to present this evening our newly arrived fellow, since some weeks. You're making us work even more at this Center for Advanced Study Law as Culture. By the challenges you bring in. For example, only 1 week ago, or about a week ago, the Weber conference, the final session, and simply brilliant talk, astonishing talk with such a presence that you really can, after that, you could retire. But you do not. You would have the right to do that. But today we are very much interested in knowing what, for example, I was talking with my students. I have a small student group here who participate, and we prepared the lecture, and we tried to find out some questions. How you really want to go beyond the Weberian manner to understand Herrschaft, and why we need to do that. In the abstract, you have announced that we must go beyond the Weberian Herrschaftssociology, and you will have very strong reasons for that. Most of you know that Martin Albrow was one of the global theorists of the first hour, one could say. There were some other guys who were interested at this time, yes, one could say also, but not very much. And we really owe, on the one hand, the burden of this very complex concept, the notions and the theorizing around this concept to you and those who discussed it with you at this time in the early 90s. But today we are somewhere else. Global civil society is emerging. We are asking what has become from the global age a bestseller around the world. I don't know in how many languages it had been translated, sometimes wrongly translated as Das Ende des Nationalstaats. We always come back to it. It's a wonderful topic for translation processes like the Iron Cage and others. But however, it is always telling a story about the perception and those who are the translators. And we try our best not to be too much lost in that. We listened also some time ago when Sam Webster presented his methodological writings, Weber's collected methodological writings, to your deep insights into Weber, because you must know, before becoming a global theorist, he was one of the most well-known reader of Max Weber in the English-speaking world, and very much also respected even in the German circle of those difficult Weberologists who all know much better than the master himself what had to be thought about his proper work. And so I had the extraordinary chance to listen to a wonderful speak you have done at Duisburg in the late 70s, 79 exactly, a wonderful talk around the questions of rationality. So I'm very happy that you are with us today and that you will present your topic from Max Weber's Sociology of Law to Sociology of Global Governance. The topic meets at the interface of our interests of a cultural sociology of legal structures, the normative world, the realm of normativity on the one hand, and on the other hand, to see and to investigate the question whether we can profit from some founding fathers and how to theorize these complex questions that the global world has brought us, especially when legal cultures do no longer stay at one place, but they're going beyond the borders like scapes, like we are talking sometimes in this circle of judicial scapes, and this brings a new situation. maybe still profit from the founding fathers, this time from Max Weber, in order to understand something I did not talk at all about, global governance, gouvernance, last time you talked about that, and what is specific in that, and whether there is a possibility to use, for example, the Weberian sociology of domination, or to try something completely different and something else. So this is in a way the general expectations we have, and this means that we are in a social relationship. In a social relationship that here at this center is a relationship of a learning community. So I'm really waiting for that, and I'm very curious to learn more about this complex relationship of the sociology of law and questions of the global world, especially global governance. The floor is yours. Very welcome at the center, especially at the forum this evening, Martin.
Thank you very much, Werner, for your very generous and eloquent introduction. You mentioned retirement. I should say, actually, that I have retired no less than 3 occasions already in my career. So there's always time for a 4th, I suppose, yes. Well, those of you who came expecting a sort of bells and whistles presentation, such as people said I gave last time, will be very disappointed. I'm going to be very formal, very Weberian, very focused. I'm going to stay at the podium. I'm told I have to stay at the podium anyway because there's a movie camera at the back. Well, from Max Weber's Sociology of Law to a Sociology of Global Governance. This is an exercise in a certain kind of sociology, one which applies rigorous conceptual analysis to complex social situations which are highly contested in public life and where ideological commitments often stand in the way of genuine dialogue. Max Weber was indeed I would say, the exemplary exponent of this particular academic genre. He brought his early legal training and the understanding of economics he acquired later to bear on historical and contemporary data so as to expose the tacit, often concealed social presuppositions and claims to validity behind power struggles, institution building, and promises of a better future. It's a special genre, not, I would say, the whole of what we might call sociology, but it has particular relevance to understanding the phenomenon of global governance, that contemporary complex of institutions and practices that provides the basis for peaceful and productive relations between countries and assists in mobilizing them and all other concerned agencies to meet global challenges. It's a kind of definition, you know, of global governance. Add one to the many existing. Weber was working in a very different period of history, where the dominant issues of the time for Western countries were the handling of problems arising out of industrial capitalism and class conflict, bureaucratization and democratization, with the parallel and linked great power rivalry and imperialist expansion. None of those items is off the agenda in our time, either within countries or globally. But he had not an inkling, and could not have had, of the genocide of the Jewish people, of the birth of the United Nations, of the threat of a nuclear holocaust, of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or of climate change consequences for human existence on this earth. Global issues, all core agenda items for global governance. His conceptual formulations were of his time, but out of his time arose our own, and we can ill afford to throw away the foundations he laid for critical analysis. We cannot stay still with his conceptualizations, but we can regard them as prototypical and a basis for constructing new ones for the new challenges. We can build on Weber, and this lecture is one small contribution to that end. At this juncture, I wish to thank Professor Werner Gebhardt for suggesting I should undertake such an exercise as this one at an early stage of my fellowship at the Käte Hamburger Kollegs, Law as Culture. It's an invaluable preliminary to any assessment of what the present system of global governance achieves and how it could be improved. Weber's sociological concepts and his sociology of law developed pari passu and are intricately interwoven. That serves the purpose here well. This is not an exercise in methodology. We will have to take account in passing of such issues as the construction of ideal types, interpretative understanding, historical configurations, but only in connection with the application and development of his concepts for our world today. There's a huge literature on all of these. This is not the time or place to evaluate it. Rather, the strategy I shall adopt is to check step by step, following his own logic, the relevance of his core formulations to global governance and make suggestions for their further development, amendment, or even contentiously, of course, at some points for discarding them. We begin inevitably then with his definitions of social action and social relationships and their meaning for social actors. For him, all human social life is built on these foundations. Meaning, Sinn. I will occasionally have to use German words. I apologize. It's because there's no adequate English rendering. Not always, anyway. Meaning, Sinn, is something carried, grasped, and intended by individuals, and is conveyed in their communication and interaction with each other. But meaning also belongs to something much wider and more extensive than individual intentions and feelings. It belongs simultaneously to culture, about which more later. Weber famously called the individual the most elementary unit, the atom in his time, for social analysis, and it is true, he insisted individuals were the bearers of all social action. But if we stop there, we don't get much further than the first page of his sociological concepts. Pivotal for further understanding of his work is the way he uses the concept of social action to define the social relationship. When, in his terms, two or more people direct their own actions towards the other or others, and these are reciprocated in some way, and thus there is a mutual orientation to each other, we can talk of the existence of a social relationship. Note, I say talk of it. That's not enough for Weber. A science of social reality, which is what he sought to shape, Wirklichkeit, could not be content with talk. There had to be evidence. After all, people infer the existence of social relationships from actual behavior. But the appropriate behavior that shows the existence of a relationship occurs only intermittently. You might observe, this is my gloss on this, and I think it's important this to grasp what he's doing. You might observe a person at work all day and still not be able to infer that he or she is a parent, or indeed that they themselves have parents. Is their relationship with their parents or their children still there, even though you don't know anything about it in the day? Of course it is. And it's real. The result of this train of thought for him was his introduction of the notion of a relationship depending on the chance that certain behavior will be exhibited at certain times, not that it occurs all the time. Are relationships real in spite of these difficulties in observing them and establishing their empirical existence? Absolutely they are real, certainly in their consequences. And we may recall that famous dictum of a contemporary of Weber's, W.I. Thomas, if men define a situation as real, then it's real in its consequences. Certainly, they are real enough for Weber to erect all his subsequent sociological concept formation on their basis. Now, that's pretty quick, isn't it? What I've done here in a couple of minutes is sketched the basis of Weber's sociology. It's not possible, to my mind, to exaggerate the strategic, intellectual, and moral significance of these formulations. or to ignore how contentious they are and how the slightest shift of emphasis can give rise to a whole alternative school of sociology. If emphasis is placed on the stability of shared meanings for the actors, we move in a direction known as structuralism. If stress is put on the experience of meaning, we enter into the heady realms of social phenomenology. If on the indeterminacy of meaning, we tread the still narrower path of ethnomethodology. On the other hand, when the contingent uncertainty of our mutual orientations to each other is stressed, we find ourselves in the company of symbolic interactionists. If we look to the conditions for maintaining relationships, the door to a materialist sociology opens for us. How often, and this is directed to those who are teachers and students, which is probably most people here, I imagine. How often is it our students' experience that they are challenged to understand all these directions of intellectual interest and then only to be told that just one is valid? How rarely, too, is my impression that they are taken back to these primary, almost Delphic Weberian formulations which are logically prior, in my mind, to all these schools of thought. We forgo the rigor of the preparation for the journey in favor of the excitement of the travel. But of course, Weber sets out on his own road and develops a distinctive sociology of his own. He takes a crucial step to reflect the extension of social relationships beyond the immediate and the personal. There was no limit in principle for him to the number of people comprised in this general understanding of a social relationship. To be possible to move with confidence beyond the people in one's immediate circle, a person has to assume a general acceptance of certain rules of behavior. So Weber stipulates that wider social organization depends on the actor's assumption that others will abide by norms, standards of acceptable behavior, and that in practice, and for most part, they do. The resulting social order, Ordnung, is then a ubiquitous feature of social life, endows action with meaning, and therefore is an aspect of culture too. Some of us here will have seen that one small step for mankind that the sadly recently deceased Neil Armstrong took on the moon towards presumably the further exploration of space. In relation to that project, it certainly was a very small step. Weber's jump to Ordnung from the individual via the capsule of the social relationship was a step of equivalent size that took us towards a global society, or what some, though not myself, would call the project of globalization. To explain what might appear an outrageous overstatement, let us consider some later developments which are at the heart of global governance. Human rights are lodged at the heart of global governance discourse. The story of how they came to be adopted as a declaration by the United Nations is complex and contested. Whereas some would see them in the tradition that stretches back through the French and American revolutions as an assertion of secular thought, there are others who point to the stress on freedom of conscience in Christian churches and an earlier tradition of God-given natural law. But in both secular and Christian views, rights are originally prior to and a source of the law, and their observance a test against which the law is judged as to whether it is just. And here we go back to, for me, the favorite forebear for Weber, although he's very rarely mentioned as such. As with much else in modern political thought, Thomas Hobbes's discussion is seminal to my mind. Indeed, his analytical method is the closest anticipation of Max Weber's approach. Hobbes regarded the rights of an individual to defend self and family, to security and the means of subsistence, as prior to any contract with the state. And indeed, the only reason for an individual giving up arms in return for the state's protection. But of course, it was out of the assertion of those individual rights that arose conflict, and it was to protect against that conflict that the contract hypothetical was made. The prior status of natural rights in his thought is often overshadowed, of course, by his additional assertion that justice is only possible in a civil society, one governed by law with a sovereign concentration of power. Hobbes's position allows for something therefore all too familiar today, that without a legal order, the assertion of rights results in conflict. My stress on Hobbes is not to find just historical parallels to Weber. He was actually a seminal figure for the development of German sociology. Ferdinand Tönnies went to Oxford to study Hobbes and indeed discovered some of Hobbes's early writings that had escaped English scholars. Tönnies needed to go no further to be persuaded that you discover the nature of our human existence in society, arguably both religious and secular, not, as is wrongly assumed, in an unhistorical state of nature. Less noticed in Hobbes has been his argument for religious freedom under the authority of the sovereign power, entrenching conscience at the heart of individual freedom. And at this point, this is the point to comment on the development of Enlightenment thought after Hobbes, so often seen as irreligious. On the contrary, its main concern was to remove religion from the clutches of churches and sects. From Voltaire to Rousseau to Kant, the philosophes were tenacious on their hold on the idea of religion, both as the natural expression of wonder at the extraordinary fact of human existence, and also as the bond of society. In that sense, religion is accessible to every individual human being, and it's this notion which underpins the right to freedom of religion in the Declaration of Human Rights. The Declaration is not, as some people would assert, irreligious. It is not anti-religious. On the contrary, it is a political and a religious intervention in religious affairs. For let us not be reluctant to say it. How many religions, churches, and sects allow their individual members freedom of conscience? How many would deny that right to individual members? The vast majority. And in that declaration, then, we have a religious proposition being offered, advanced as valid for all humankind, part of a normative order, a shared set of rules for living together, Ordnung, to which any individual can appeal, and the influence of which grows with every year. How well do Weber's concepts fit this development? It certainly does not accord with his own view of the law in his day becoming increasingly positive, namely the result of state legislation. In his view, lawmaking by reference to natural rights was declining in significance. His definition of natural law was, natural law is the sum total of all those norms which are valid independently of and superior to positive law, and which owe their dignity not to arbitrary enactment, but on the contrary, provide the very legitimation for the binding force of positive law. I think that's as good a statement of the dignity of human rights in relation to national laws as you could get from anyone. And here we have it from Max Weber. For him, history provided plenty of examples. The English Magna Carta, for instance, and those examples gained strength from both religious and secular sources in the Enlightenment, and they became particularly prevalent at the beginning of modern times in the American and French revolutions. That's Weber's account. And revolutionary classes, of course, appealed to natural law. But it's at this point that Weber turns from history, where I don't think we can disagree with him, to an assessment of his own time, declaring that natural law axioms have now been deeply discredited by the rise of socialism and the evolutionary dogmatism of Marxism and realpolitik. Well, from that standpoint, at that time, Weber now could hardly fail to be astonished, not just by the declaration, but also by the extension of it into rights for women, children, economic and social rights, and the use by multilateral institutions and non-governmental organizations of human rights as standards for judging the performance of governments in securing the welfare of their citizens. His time was so different. His view of what he called the irresistible advance of positive law was reinforced from another direction by his assessment of the position of the legal profession, which had in earlier times often taken the side of the underdog. But the disappearance of belief in natural law, he said, meant that professional lawyers simply tended to adopt the position of the ruling, authoritarian, legitimate power. The German is der jeweils gerade herrschenden, legitimen, autoritären politischen Gewalten. There are many reasons for thinking that Weber in part bemoans this direction, but at the same time it exercised, in my view, a baneful influence on his concept formation. The power of the state and the opinion of the legal profession were moving in lockstep with each other, and Weber adapted a perfectly good everyday concept to reflect this movement, namely Herrschaft. Now, the particular way he chose to do this, I believe, makes it seriously unhelpful in understanding how global governance works today. While we can follow Weber gladly with Ordnung, we can no longer travel along his road to Herrschaft. This will be, for many scholars, a contentious viewpoint, so to justify it, let me return to his fundamental concepts. As we saw, Weber built up his sociology from first principles, from individuals, meaning, social acts, relationships, up to social order. But between the simple one-to-one relationship and social order came all kinds of intermediate clusterings of relationships of varying meanings, size, and with their own kinds of order. Famously, two fundamental types Weber stressed, along with his hugely respected senior sociologist Tönnies, were Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. So important, they have entered the English literature without translation. But within these two broad types, there were many constellations. There were the Hausgemeinschaft, the Nachbargemeinschaft, the Sippe, the Sprachgemeinschaft, all kinds of Verband, Anstalt, Verein, Betrieb, and one special type of Anstaltsbetrieb, the state. In almost all of these, even in the Sprachgemeinschaft, to a greater or lesser extent, Herrschaft featured as a binding element. Ordnung on its own was not enough to hold these social entities together, composed as they were of individuals in relationships with each other, orienting towards a social order. That's not enough to keep them going. There has to be Herrschaft as well. Note, I've stopped translating these terms, not because they're untranslatable, but because they operate within a German-speaking culture and legal system in a specific way. Ordnung, order, is easy in English, although even there I'm reminded of the German saying, I was reminded of it, Ordnung ist das halbe Lebens. I've never heard in English, order is the half of life. One of our sociological colleagues in our Weber conference told me she always replied to her mother when her mother pointed out that very well-known fact. She said, well, I will choose the other half. So there is a healthy German rebelliousness too. But Herrschaft has its particular problems, and not just its clear sexist bias. I've inquired whether anyone has proposed Damenschaft, but apparently that has no takers. For a start, a variety of translations indicates the difficulty in rendering it in English. Various eminent translators have from time to time proposed authority, domination, dominion, rule, rulership, all inadequate attempts to convey that sense of people acting to fulfill the commands of someone more powerful. For that is the concept Weber begins with. Herrschaft is a kind of power exercised through command. That's a simple notion. It's got an everyday meaning, and the fact that German has a word for it and English needs a sentence doesn't in itself make for a bad concept. Arguably, indeed, it's beneficial to be able to express something so succinctly. But this is where the problems for Weber begin, because everyday language is too imprecise for science, and he feels a duty to refine the idea. First of all, with Herrschaft, he says, obedience is of the essence. And then there's the idea of obeying, though, because there can be all kinds of reasons for obeying, there are all kinds of motives for obeying, and so on. But if you want to get to a purer kind of Herrschaft, you've got to have a belief that it's right. You've got to have a belief that it's legitimate, that it's right to obey. And different kinds of belief in its rightness give us different kinds of Herrschaft. Very famously, of course, the rational type, the traditional type, and the charismatic type. Weberians all know these, but I won't go into them. Some might differ from me on this by referring to the 8th part of the 4th edition of Herrschaft und Gesellschaft, which bears the heading die nicht legitime Herrschaft, for his section on the city. Now, I've checked this with my colleague, Weber expert here, Sam Wimster, and he agrees with me that the appearance of die nicht legitime Herrschaft there is a bit of a surprise, because it didn't appear in the first edition, so it was inserted at some later date. I don't find any authority, any warrant in the Weber text for a concept of nicht legitime Herrschaft. It can't exist by his definitions. So how that got there, we don't know. There may be Weber specialists here who can tell me. I leave it to Weber experts on the origin of the published text to explain how nicht legitime Herrschaft got there, because it was added after his death, inconsistent with everything else he wrote. You can have power, that is Macht and nicht legitime Macht, which may result in orders being obeyed, but that still is not Herrschaft. There is a further tightening of the conceptual screw, however, which makes the Herrschaft relationship even closer than one of power backed by commands issued legitimately. The further tightening of the screw is they have to be obeyed unquestioningly, without reference to a personal judgment on their value. Now, this is especially important for Weber in the context of bureaucracy, because he maintains that no legitimate order of any scale can survive without an administrative staff. As he says, for practical purposes, Herrschaft means Verwaltung. We end up then with the core of the Herrschaft in the bureaucracy, and that itself works in blind adherence to commands, though of course those commands take sometimes the form of rules, standing orders. Again, this is a slight sketch, a highly condensed sketch of Weber's position. It only touches the surface of what has become a vast subsequent literature, much of it very critical. One strong line taken first by Parsons, Gouldner, and then by myself is to ask why Weber could not conceive of professional authority along with his rational, traditional, and charismatic. That's a well-known criticism. I really think it's well established now. Obeying others because of their professional knowledge is quite as important in contemporary life as obeying them because of their legal position or their charismatic appeal or because of their traditional standing. Weber does say there are 4 kinds of legitimate order. Ordnung can have 4 kinds of legitimacy, and one of those is belief in values. But he's only got 3 kinds of legitimate Herrschaft, and the reason he can't have that 4th kind is precisely because he has excluded the possibility of questioning the basis of the order. That is conceptually excluded. He knows very well empirically orders will be questioned, but then that's no longer Herrschaft. No wonder one of Weber's most knowledgeable and early critics on this subject, Carl Friedrich, said of his formulations that they reeked of Prussian authoritarianism. I apologize to anyone here from Berlin. Some of my best friends are Prussian. Perhaps the most revealing of all for this tendency in Weber is an incidental remark that slavery is the purest kind of Herrschaft. Where does all this come from? Well, we heard from Professor Garcia last week how closely Weber and his brother Alfred were to each other in sharing a belief that bureaucracy was leading to the enslavement of modern man and the dehumanization of the individual. The road Weber trod with his concept of Herrschaft was the slippery slope down to the modern inferno, or for Zygmunt Bauman, to the gas chambers. And it did happen. So we might ask, what went wrong with Weber's formulations? Well, some would say it didn't merely reflect his time, it reinforced its tendencies and helped to prepare for the dictatorship to come. And of course, that means some have seen him as a precursor to Nazism, a complex judgment based on the theory of the construction of social reality and the part concepts play in it. Certainly, ever since Stanley Milgram's renowned experiments on authoritarianism, we give due significance to what he called the agentic state, behaving like an automaton in response to orders. So perhaps we should give credit to Weber for recognizing it as a fact of life in his own time. But as for what his position would have been towards Nazism, all I would say is that anyone who appreciates Weber's idea of the Kulturmensch must surely realize he would have regarded Hitler and his gang with the utmost contempt. The problem Weber's account of Herrschaft leaves with us, however, is that he tied his formulae so closely to tendencies of his time that he has made it unusable for us in the present. It is, I suggest, a historical relic, and in doing so, he has almost discredited attempts to ground authority in the English sense, or, shall we say, to establish a reasonable idea of Herrschaft. In other words, Herrschaft which you can question, Herrschaft which is open to rational discussion. When it comes to global governance, we have to return to his more fundamental concepts, individual relationships, order, and what became ever more important in the later part of his work, values. As I mentioned in my lecture last week, it's an old word, governance, gouvernance, in French and English, with continuous use going back to the 14th century. And as the acts, practices, and institutions of governing, it's applicable in a wide variety of contexts. In the late 20th century, it was and remains widely used for the way large corporations run themselves. And in the 1990s, it became very popular among international organizations in considering national regimes. It has the advantage, for comparative purposes, of being non-committal on types of government, degrees of democracy, equality, or even freedom. One president of the World Bank expressed it this way in 1991 in an internal discussion paper. Problems of governance are universal, not particular to one region or only to the developing world. Every country is different, and a thorough understanding of the historical, social, and cultural traditions of each country should underpin the bank's response to the problem. This short document, directed to the bank's staff, emphasized that good governance in the countries where the bank was involved in development had three key dimensions: accountability, the legal framework for development, and information and transparency. You will notice authority isn't mentioned. So it's intriguing, when the OECD published its collection of papers, Governance in the 21st Century, which was in 2001, this brief gloss appears. Looking at governance as the general exercise of authority, I think that's an interesting allusion to Herrschaft, and I think it's probably because the first author was German. And it goes on in this way. It seems that over the long run, there has been a clear reduction in the absolute or unconstrained power of those in positions of power. In other words, they perceived a shift in Herrschaft going in the opposite direction to the one Weber conceived. In that same OECD report, I was asked to give a sociological interpretation of governance, and I hope you'll forgive me in quoting myself. I commented on the way the idea of society had been rehabilitated in political discourse in the 1990s, in ideas like information or knowledge society, civil society, and social capital, while at the same time, in what was called the cultural turn of society, was dissolving into shifting flows of symbols, as in apadurized scapes. In the face of the widespread sense of ever-increasing social diversity, I argued governance was the state's representation of that condition where the quest for stable axioms and points of reference becomes urgent. We can see governance in a simple way as the management of society by the people. It's the diversity of humankind globally which generates the problems for local governance, but also makes absolutely necessary a variety of different country solutions. End of quote. I went on to argue that long-term, the practical problems for governance extended across the globe, and that the experience of the IMF's handling of economic crises in Russia and East Asia showed how a one-size-fits-all solution was inappropriate. Remember, this is still at the time when globalization was riding high in the speeches of Bill Clinton particularly. For me, I said globalization is the problem, not the solution. The sources of instability in the new global society are the shifts in the distribution of capital that threaten to open the wounds of old ethnic, religious, and cultural cleavages and to create new ones like the digital divide. Governance was the watchword of the 1990s, and the idea of global governance, like governance, was promoted by multilateral bodies and individuals dedicated to working across boundaries for human well-being. The report of the Commission of Global Governance, published as Our Global Neighborhood in 1995, was the culmination of efforts by Willy Brandt to seize the initiative in a meeting at Königswinter after the fall of the Berlin Wall, in that brief period when so much seemed possible. There was a meeting in Stockholm in 1991 around a prepared document, Common Responsibility in the 1990s, the Stockholm Initiative on Global Security and Governance, which led on to Brandt inviting Ingvar Carlsson and Sridhar Thrampal to co-chair the Commission on Global Governance. Their report is still a rich source for anyone who wants to get hold of the developing narrative of the global age in that period, with the terminology which was new then and which we take for granted now: sustainable development, global civil society, global security, and people's empowerment. It was not, I should stress, of course, ever a language which arose without contest, opposition, and so on, and I'm very grateful for Upendra Baxi's critique, which he published in 1996, very shortly after that document was published, a critique of the report of the Commission on Global Governance. And I'm sorry I didn't have the benefit of reading it before I wrote my paper. I now have had the benefit of reading it and say that it is a marvelous contrast between the global neighborhood on the one hand and universal otherhood on the other hand. And Upendra advocates very strongly a whole range of issues which are easily suppressed under the concept of global governance and global neighborhood. I do think the neighborhood concept, of course, is inadequate for handling global challenges, and I think global challenges actually take us further than the concept of neighborhood can. But it's still a rich source for anyone who wants to get hold of that developing narrative. And its definition of global governance, this is its definition, well, I will quote: governance is the sum of the many ways individuals and institutions, private and public, manage their common affairs. It's a continuing process through which conflicting or diverse interests may be accommodated and cooperative action may be taken. At the global level, governance has been viewed primarily as intergovernmental relationships, but it now must be understood as involving non-governmental organization, citizens' movements, multinational corporations, and the global capital market. Intersecting with these are global mass media of dramatically enlarged influence, end of quote. This is a world and an age away from Max Weber's. Yet I argue his basis for informed sociological analysis is one on which we can build for understanding this contemporary condition. Leave on one side the tendentious development of his idea of Herrschaft, and we find a repertoire of concepts which can take us in the direction of our own time. The first and most obvious is his stress on the individual as the basic unit. Much of contemporary sociology, Turenne, one thinks of, Ulrich Beck, for example, have stressed individualization as a dominant process in contemporary society. But for Weber, the individual was a universal starting point in any culture, making it easier, to my mind, to identify our contemporary individualization not as some freeing of individuals from the chains of society, but rather yet another type of identity formation in a networked environment. Indeed, the series of steps Weber takes to bring us to the point of analyzing entities and like Verband and Anstalt are exactly the kind which allow us to conceptualize the social networks of the internet without the difficulty older formulations in sociology of primary, secondary groups have in dealing with issues of presence and absence. Presence, absence are intrinsically variable to a relationship as far as Weber is concerned. The intermittent nature of interaction, which is the basis of all relationships and brings the empirical studies of their study, which are for some magnified by the new communication technology, I think wrongly, they pose no problems for Weber's approach. It's intrinsic to Weber's concept of a social relationship that its boundaries, qualities, strength, durability are always fluid and changing. And this applies to the most complex configurations. He is always emphasizing subtle gradations. And I've got a series of quotes here. These are all quotes from Weber. A social relationship can be of a very fleeting character or of varying degrees of permanence. Subjective meaning can be partly constant, partly changing. Transitions in orientation to an Ordnung from motives of tradition or expediency to the case where a belief in its legitimacy is involved are empirically gradual. Extent and methods of regulation and exclusion in relation to outsiders may vary widely, so the transition from a state of openness to one of regulation is gradual. Regulation and closure are relative concepts. They're all manner of gradual shadings as between an exclusive club, a theatrical audience, a party rally, from a church service open to the general public to the mysteries of a secret cult. One could go on for page after page with such illustrations that Weber had of the intrinsic fluidity of his social matter, of his subject matter. He's the original sociologist of flows, of the ambiguities of social life and its ever-changing constellations. And this quality of Weber's sociology is evident equally in his treatment of Ordnung, probable regularities of behavior, the meaning of which depends on following rules, maxims which are regarded as binding, backed up in the strongest cases by belief in their rightness. Where we find empirical evidence that Ordnung backed by legitimacy prevails in people's lives, then we talk of the validity, Geltung, of the Ordnung in sociological terms. Such an Ordnung can be called a convention if it's upheld through disapproval or informal sanctions. When enforced by a special staff, then it is law. So you get law deeply embedded within a very, very fluid treatment of the idea of Ordnung. Now, I apologize to those here who have a deep familiarity with these famous Weberian formulae, but my purpose in repeating them is to stress that Weber, the qualified German jurist, is offering a sociological definition of law which permits cross-cultural comparison. Vengeance perpetrated by a clan is a marginal case of law, he says. In his terms, international law without an agency to enforce it, depending only on reprisals, is a matter of convention. But of course, the situation is different now with international law, as is evident with the Global Governance Commission report, which it concludes with the heading Enforcing International Law, where it says the very essence of global governance is the capacity of international community to ensure compliance with the rules of society. And it goes on to stress how national courts are enforcing human rights law and complying with the rulings of regional and supranational bodies like the European Court of Justice. And this, of course, predates the founding of the International Court of Criminal Justice. Now, Weber's approach to sociology allows, of course, for those developments. It is equally explicit on the coexistence of different legal orders in the same territory, as, for instance, with Roman Catholic canon law, codes of the guilds, and city-state law. Having made special studies of ancient and medieval law, he therefore had no difficulty at all in recognizing legal pluralism in our own time. But where I think he would have been most astonished, although his concepts would have allowed for it, and we can begin by using them, is with the vast proliferation of enforceable codes by multilateral institutions and transnational organizations, even by transnational private organizations. A recent book by Tim Bute and Walter Mackley, The New Global Rulers, the Privatization of Regulation in the World Economy, compares and contrasts the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, and the International Accounting Standards Board. They both provide regulations for most of the world's business accounting today. They're somewhat in competition with each other. They're sometimes in conflict with each other, but firms have to choose which code they follow. But they have no place in international law and are basically clubs representing private interests. Yet their impact has great public significance. European national standards boards, for instance, are represented on those bodies even though they are still private organizations. Another recent book by Frank Vibert, Democracy and Dissent, The Challenge of International Rulemaking, addresses head-on the question of the public accountability of these transnational bodies and questions the assumption that multi-level governance, where interlocking bodies of national experts and the multilateral institutions aided by non-governmental bodies, can ever generate democratic accountability. These are cases of bodies making rules for their own members, and effectively, in Weber's terms, law, since it is enforced, yet with those consequences going way beyond their members. The workings of the multilateral financial institutions, IMF, World Bank, WTO, are much more widely publicized, of course, and are run by unelected officials. They, along with NAFTA, became the focus of the anti-globalization movement in Seattle in 1999, and the subsequent regular meetings of the World Social Forum are expressions of, or at least anticipations of, a global politics in the global age. It is in the interplay of nation states, the multilateral institutions, global corporations, and a diverse global public of activists and NGOs that we find the greatest departure from the world of Weber's time, and where we are obliged to engage in conceptual innovation. We can build on him, as I've suggested, but if I'm going to single out any one point where we are forced to recognize contradictions in his own position, it has to be in his evaluation of the position of officials. But even there, we can, I think, use Weberian insights. His last formulations highlighted the category of value-rational action as an option for individuals, while at the same time ruling that out as a possible orientation for the bureaucrat working in state or capitalist organizations. Yet the proliferation of agencies at national and international level that operate to realize values in a professional manner means they rely on value judgment in a strict sense, where what is health, what is good for the environment, what respects human rights, is the outcome of dialogue but within agencies and across their boundaries with wider publics. Perhaps the most striking contrast with Weber's time is the insistence now on transparency in these agencies, when, of course, he regarded secrecy as intrinsic to the working of bureaucracy. It makes what Werner Gebhardt has named the validity culture of officials working nationally and globally of key importance in estimating the directions that global governance will take. And it means we have to follow another path in Weber's thought beyond the sociology of law, the problem of conflict between value spheres, something for another occasion. These issues have been brewing for a long time in the world, also with me. And as this is my first lecture in your series, Werner, perhaps you'll allow me a final indulgence. I gave a national lecture entitled Public Administration and Sociological Theory to the British Association for the Advancement of Science in 1971, a few years ago. And it concluded with the following remark. The professional official, and this followed an argument in which I was criticizing the Weberian bureaucratic formulation, the professional official has achieved emancipation from the machine to follow the objectives of his own professional conscience. It makes the content of that conscience of immediate concern to us all. Whether a society directed above all to train the professional can also educate this concern among the rest of its members will be decisive for the quality of social order in the next decades. Now, I turned that up the other day and I was quite pleased. I thought that really is a Weberian comment, even though ostensibly it stems from Weber, from a criticism of Weber. It departs from his account of bureaucracy for a time that was already very different from that at the time of his death 50 years before. But I think it caught the direction of changes underway at that time in 1971. Now we have to do the same 40 years on. And since 1971, we've had end of Cold War, growing environmental crisis, internet, economic globalization, global jihad, and the rise of China. We need to register those with Weberian rigor through new concepts appropriate for our own time. I suggest global governance is one such concept. Upendra, sorry. Thank you very much.